The gun went off before I even reached the door of the diner, and I froze on the sidewalk with my son's hand crushed inside mine. People screamed inside. A window cracked. Someone shouted for everyone to get down, and through the glass, I saw men in dark coats moving fast between the tables, flipping one over as a shield. My son Toby pressed his face into my coat, and I pressed my hand over his ear, my heart slamming so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Then it stopped. Just like that, silence dropped over the street like a curtain falling on a stage. I should have turned around. Any sane woman would have turned around, grabbed her son, and walked the other way. But my legs were shaking too hard to run, and Toby was hungry, and I had exactly $9 in my pocket, and no place else within walking distance that served food this late. So when the door opened and a waitress stepped out, pale but alive, waving people back inside like nothing unusual had happened, I followed the small, foolish crowd that followed her. Inside, the diner looked almost normal. A cracked window. An overturned chair someone was already setting right. The smell of burnt coffee and gunpowder mixing in a way that made my stomach turn. Every booth was full except one, at the very back, where a man sat alone with two others standing near him like fence posts. He did not look shaken. That was the first thing I noticed. Everyone else in that diner had wide eyes and shaking hands, but this man sat with his elbows on the table, sleeves rolled to his forearms, sipping black coffee as if nothing at all had happened 5 minutes ago. His jaw was sharp, his eyes darker than the coffee, and there was a stillness in him that felt more dangerous than the gunfire had been. There was one open seat left in that entire diner. It was across from him. I should have taken Toby and left. I told myself that even as my feet carried me toward the booth, because my son was tugging at my sleeve, whispering that his stomach hurt, and there was nowhere else to sit, and I was too tired, too broke, and too out of options to care about the danger radiating off the man in front of me. "Can I sit here?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. The two men beside him shifted, but he lifted one hand, barely an inch, and they went still again. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like it was peeling back my coat and my tired eyes, and finding every worry underneath. Then he looked at Toby, who was staring at him with the fearless curiosity that only a 6-year-old could manage, after nearly getting shot. "Sit," the man said. His voice was low, even, the kind of calm that came from a man who never had to raise it to be obeyed. "But you're not walking away after." I laughed, actually laughed, a short, nervous sound, because I thought he was joking. Nobody looked at that face and thought he was joking twice. I sat anyway. Toby climbed onto the seat beside me, and immediately reached for the little menu card wedged behind the napkin holder, flipping it over to the picture of pancakes, like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened at all. Children forgive the world faster than adults do. I envied him for that. "You always let strangers threaten you and then sit down anyway?" the man asked. "You always shoot up diners and then order coffee." I shot back before I could stop myself. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The two men standing near him exchanged a glance I did not understand. "I didn't shoot anyone," he said. "Someone tried to shoot me. There's a difference. Feels the same from where I was standing." "You weren't standing. You were about to run." He wasn't wrong, and that annoyed me more than anything else he'd said. I busied myself with the menu, though my eyes weren't really reading the words, and I could feel him watching me the entire time, unbothered, like a man studying a puzzle he already suspected he could solve. The waitress came by, hands trembling slightly as she poured water, and took our order without writing anything down. Toby asked for pancakes with extra syrup. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a bowl of soup, doing quiet math in my head about the $9 in my pocket, and whether it would stretch to cover both of us. "Add the pancakes with the eggs, and get her the roast dinner," the man said before the waitress could leave. "Put it on my table." "That's not necessary," I said quickly, heat rushing to my face. I had been poor for 3 years now, since Toby's father decided fatherhood was a costume he didn't want to wear anymore, and I had learned exactly how much pride cost when you couldn't afford groceries. I wasn't going to sell what little I had left to a stranger with blood on his sleeve, even if it wasn't his own. "It's not charity," he said. "You sat at my table. That makes you my guest tonight. I don't let guests eat soup while I eat steak. I didn't see steak on your table. I haven't ordered it yet. Toby laughed, a real laugh, the kind that made the tight knot in my chest loosen slightly despite everything. The man's eyes moved to my son, and something in his face changed, just barely, like a door opening a crack in a wall that otherwise looked solid all the way through. "What's your name?" I asked, because it felt strange to keep calling him nothing in my head. "Adrian," he said, "Adrian Kane." I recognized the name the second it left his mouth, though I couldn't have said from where at first. It came to me slowly, like a memory surfacing through fog, a name whispered in the break room at the diner where I used to waitress, a name printed once in small letters under a photograph in the local paper next to a building that burned down under circumstances nobody wanted to talk about. Adrian Kane owned half the warehouses on the east side of the city. Adrian Kane was the reason certain streets emptied out after dark. Adrian Kane was not a man whose table you sat at by accident and walked away from unchanged. "I've heard of you," I said carefully. "Most people have," he answered, unbothered. "What have you heard?" "That people who cross you don't stay around long." "That's true." He said it simply, without pride or shame, the way another man might admit he preferred his coffee black. "What else?" I hesitated. Toby was humming to himself, tracing shapes in the condensation on his water glass, blissfully unaware that his mother was sitting across from a man half the city feared. "That you don't get involved with people outside your world," I said finally. "That, whoever you decide to notice, usually ends up in trouble." For the first time since I'd sat down, he actually smiled. It transformed his whole face, softened the sharp lines around his mouth, and for one dangerous second, I understood exactly why people underestimated men like him until it was too late. "Then you already know, you shouldn't have sat here," he said. "There wasn't anywhere else to sit." "There's always somewhere else to sit." His eyes held mine, steady and unblinking. "You chose this seat because some part of you wanted to know what happens next." I wanted to argue. I opened my mouth to argue. But the truth sat heavy and undeniable in my chest. Because he was right, and I hated that he was right. There had been 3 empty stools at the counter when I walked in. I hadn't even glanced at them. The food came quickly, faster than any diner food had ever come for me before, and Toby dug into his pancakes with the single-minded joy of a child who didn't yet understand that some meals were bought with more than money. I ate slowly, watching Adrian Kane over the rim of my water glass, trying to decide if the fear coiling in my stomach was the smart kind, or the kind that would keep me from something I might regret missing. "Tell me about yourself," he said, when the plates were half empty, and the diner had returned to its normal, nervous hum around us. "There's nothing interesting to tell." "I doubt that." "I work 2 jobs. I have a 6-year-old. My ex left when Toby was 3. That's the whole story." I said it flatly, the way you say something you've repeated so many times it no longer has the power to hurt you out loud, even if it still hurts everywhere else. "That's not the whole story," Adrian said quietly. "That's the summary." Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten unexpectedly. Nobody had asked me for more than the summary in years. People heard single mother, 2 jobs, and their eyes moved on, already calculating how quickly they could end the conversation. Adrian Kane just watched me, waiting, like he had all the time in the world and intended to spend it right there. "Why does it matter to you?" I asked. "Because you sat at my table during the 1 hour of the year someone tried to kill me," he said, and the words landed like stones in still water. "That doesn't happen by accident, not in my experience. It was a coincidence. I don't believe in those." Toby yawned loudly beside me, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, and the practical part of my brain elbowed its way back to the front. It was late. He had school in the morning, a school I could barely afford, in a neighborhood I was trying desperately to move him out of, before something worse than gunfire found its way to our door. "We should go," I said, already reaching for my coat. "Sit," Adrian said again, and this time, the word carried a different weight, less an invitation, and more a fact I hadn't yet accepted. "You're not walking out of this diner and disappearing into the city like we never met. I told you that before you sat down. You don't know anything about me. I know your name is on the tip of my tongue, and you haven't told it to me yet," he said. I know you flinched when the gun went off, but you didn't run, because running would have meant leaving him behind, and you'd rather stand still and take whatever comes than let go of his hand. I know you counted your money under the table before you ordered, and I know you're furious with yourself right now for accepting a meal you couldn't say no to. I stared at him, unable to answer, because every word had landed exactly where it was aimed. Grace, I said finally, quietly. My name is Grace Bennett. This is Toby. Grace, he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. I'll walk you both home. That's not necessary. It wasn't a question. He stood, dropping bills on the table without counting them, more money than the meal could have possibly cost. His two men fell into step behind him instantly, silent, watchful, scanning the street through the window before he even reached the door. Someone tried to put a bullet in this diner tonight, Grace. I'm not letting you walk 2 blocks alone in the dark after that, whether you like it or not. I wanted to refuse. I opened my mouth to refuse, but Toby had already slipped his small hand into Adrian's, without hesitation, without fear, the way children do when some instinct tells them a stranger is safe, even when the adults around them are still deciding. And something about that simple, trusting gesture undid the last of my resistance. We walked out into the cold together, an unlikely trio, trailed by 2 men who watched every shadow like it might hide another gun. I didn't know it yet, walking beside a man the whole city feared with my son's hand in his, but that single decision to sit at his table had already closed a door behind me that I would never manage to open again. The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the diner, and I nearly dropped the pan I was holding. Nobody knocked on my door at 7 in the morning, not the landlord who preferred to slide threatening notes under it instead of facing me directly, not neighbors, who mostly avoided the woman in apartment 4 with the crying baby years ago, and the quiet, watchful boy now. I set the pan down, wiped my hands on my sleeve, and looked through the peephole, half expecting trouble. It was Adrian Kane, standing in my hallway in a coat that probably cost more than my rent, looking entirely out of place against the peeling paint and flickering light behind him. I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. How do you know where I live? I walked you home 3 nights ago, he said, as if that answered everything. I remember things. That doesn't mean you get to show up unannounced. I called first. I don't have your number to have missed a call. He tilted his head slightly, something close to amusement crossing his face. Fair point. I should have sent someone ahead. I'm not used to needing permission. Get used to it, I said, though my heart was beating too fast for the words to come out as firmly as I wanted. Toby appeared behind me then, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction, and his face lit up the moment he saw who was standing in the hallway. Adrian! He shouted, delighted, squeezing past my legs before I could stop him. So much for keeping a locked chain between my son and a man half the city feared. I gave up and unlatched the door, stepping back to let him inside, mostly because I didn't want this conversation happening where the neighbors could hear every word. Adrian stepped into my small apartment and looked around slowly, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the mismatched furniture, the crack running along the ceiling that I still hadn't found the money to fix. Sit, I said, echoing his own word back at him from the diner, though there was nowhere to sit except my one worn couch, or a kitchen chair with a wobbly leg. He chose the kitchen chair, testing its balance without comment, and folded his hands on the table like he had all morning to spend here. Why are you here? I asked, standing rather than sitting, keeping the counter between us like a wall. I wanted to see how you were both doing after the other night. We're fine. You're not sleeping, he said, studying my face with the same unnerving attention he'd shown at the diner. There are shadows under your eyes that weren't there 3 days ago. I work nights at the laundromat and mornings cleaning offices downtown. Shadows are part of the job. That's a lot of hours for one person. It's what pays the rent, I said, sharper than I intended. Most of it, anyway. Something in his expression shifted, and I regretted the words the moment they left my mouth, because I hadn't meant to reveal that much. Toby, oblivious to the tension humming between the adults in the room, had climbed onto the couch and was flipping through one of his picture books, narrating the story to himself in a whisper. How much do you still owe? Adrian asked. That's not your business. I'm making it my business. Why? The word came out louder than I meant, frustration finally cracking through the careful control I'd been holding since he walked through my door. Why does any of this matter to you? You're a stranger. Less than a stranger. I know what people say about you, Adrian. I know what kind of world you live in. And I have a 6-year-old son sitting 10 feet away from you right now. I can't afford to owe men like you anything. He didn't flinch at that, didn't look offended, just watched me with that same maddening stillness. I haven't asked you for anything. Not yet. Grace. He said my name carefully, like he was choosing it deliberately from a list of gentler words. I'm not here to collect a debt from you. I'm here because 3 nights ago, someone opened fire on a diner I was sitting in, and less than a minute later, a woman I had never met sat down across from me with her son and didn't run when she found out who I was. That doesn't happen to me. People run from me, Grace. Every day, in every direction. You didn't. I didn't have anywhere else to go. You could have taken him and gone hungry rather than sit with me. Some people would have. You didn't. He leaned forward slightly. I want to know why. I didn't have a good answer for that, not one I was willing to say out loud, so I busied myself pouring coffee I didn't really want, buying time while my mind scrambled for footing. The truth was simpler and more embarrassing than anything I could dress up in dignity. I had been too tired, too hungry, too worn down by 3 years of scraping by alone, to have any fight left in me for fear of a stranger, dangerous or not. I was tired, I said finally. That's all it was. I was too tired to be afraid of one more thing. Something about that answer seemed to land differently than he expected. He sat back slightly, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore slipped, just enough for me to see something almost like understanding underneath it. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in a long time, he said quietly. We sat in silence for a moment, Toby's whispered narration filling the gap between us, and I found myself studying Adrian Kane, the way he'd studied me, trying to find the seams where the dangerous man ended and whoever he actually was began. I need to get him to school, I said eventually, glancing at the clock on the wall, and I have a shift in an hour. He stood immediately, no argument, though something in the set of his shoulders told me this wasn't over, not by a long distance. At the door, he paused, turning back with an expression I hadn't seen on him yet, something careful and almost hesitant. The landlord who keeps sliding notes under your door, he said. What's his name? My stomach dropped. How do you know about that? I noticed the paper on your kitchen table, eviction notice, 30 days. His voice stayed even, but something underneath it had gone hard, controlled. What's his name, Grace? Don't, I said quickly, panic rising in my chest. Whatever you're thinking, don't. I don't need you fixing my problems for me. I've handled worse than a landlord before. I'm not fixing anything, he said. I'm asking a question. You're not going to hurt him. Something flickered across his face, almost offense, almost amusement, hard to separate the two. I don't need to hurt people to get what I want most of the time, Grace. Reputation does a lot of the work before I ever have to. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be true. He reached for the door handle, then stopped, looking back at me one more time. I'll find out his name either way. You might as well save me the trouble. I stared at him for a long moment, weighing the exhaustion of 3 years of fighting alone against every instinct telling me to keep this man as far from my life as possible. In the end, exhaustion won, the way it usually did. Harmon, I said quietly. Gerald Harmon. He owns the building. Adrian nodded once, filed the name away behind those dark, unreadable eyes, and left without another word, his 2 silent men falling into step behind him in the hallway, like shadows that had been waiting there the whole time. I didn't hear from him again for 4 days, and I told myself that was for the best. I went back to my routine, the laundromat at night, the office building at dawn, dropping Toby at school with his backpack half falling apart at the seams, coming home to reheat whatever was cheapest in the pot. I told myself Adrian Kane had been a strange, dangerous distraction, a chapter that had already closed itself. Then, on the 5th day, I came home to find an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a single piece of paper, a letter from Gerald Harmon, formally rescinding the eviction notice, citing a clerical error, wishing me continued tenancy at my current rate, which I noticed had somehow dropped by nearly half. There was no note from Adrian. There didn't need to be one. I stood in the hallway holding that letter with my hands shaking, torn between relief so overwhelming it made my knees weak, and a fear that ran even deeper, because I understood now, in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand at the diner, exactly how much power one quiet conversation with Adrian Kane could move in this city. That night, after Toby was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table, with the letter in front of me, and made a decision I would spend the following weeks second-guessing. I found the business card he had left tucked into Toby's coat pocket, small and plain, nothing but a name and a number, no company, no title, nothing that announced what he truly was to the world. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "Grace," he said, and something in the way he said my name made the fear in my chest tangle up with something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to name yet. "You shouldn't have done that," I said. "I did a lot of things today. You'll need to be more specific. The eviction, my rent, I know it was you. I told you I wasn't fixing your problems. You're lying." A pause stretched over the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, quieter, more careful than I'd heard it before. "I'm not going to apologize for it, Grace. I don't apologize for things I'd do again." "Why?" I asked, the same question I'd asked in my kitchen days before, the one he still hadn't truly answered. "Why does any of this matter to you? You barely know us." "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember," he said slowly, like the words cost him something to say out loud, "I met someone who didn't want anything from me the moment they found out who I was. And I find I don't want to let that go." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, long after the call ended, staring at the crack in my ceiling, understanding with a cold, creeping certainty that whatever door I had opened by sitting at his table 3 nights ago had already swung far too wide to close again. 2 days later, my ex-husband called for the first time in 8 months, and the sound of his voice on my answering machine told me instantly that trouble had found me from an entirely different direction. I almost didn't play the message twice. Dean Ashford had a way of making his voice sound reasonable, even when the words underneath it were anything but, and I had spent 3 years learning to recognize the difference. He said he'd been thinking about Toby. He said he wanted to be more involved. He said he had a lawyer now, a good one, and that things had changed for him, that he was in a better position than he used to be, and that maybe it was time to talk about custody like adults instead of strangers. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to it a third time, my stomach twisting tighter with every word, because I knew Dean Ashford well enough to know that nothing he said was ever as simple as it sounded. He hadn't called in 8 months. He hadn't sent a birthday card, hadn't asked how Toby was doing in school, hadn't once mentioned wanting to be more involved until now, and the timing of it, so soon after the eviction notice disappeared and my rent was quietly cut in half, felt less like a coincidence than I wanted it to be. I didn't call him back that night. I lay awake instead, staring at the same crack in the ceiling I'd been staring at for 3 years, running through every version of the conversation we might have, none of which ended anywhere good. Dean had never wanted to be a father when it cost him something. I couldn't imagine what had changed his mind now, except that everything in my life recently seemed to trace itself back, one way or another, to the man whose card was sitting on my kitchen table. In the morning, I dropped Toby at school and walked to my cleaning shift with my mind still tangled in worry, replaying Dean's voice, wondering if I was imagining a connection that wasn't there, or if I was finally starting to understand exactly how large a shadow Adrian Kane cast over everything he touched, whether he meant to or not. By the time I got home that evening, exhausted and aching from 6 hours of scrubbing floors that weren't mine, there was a second envelope taped to my door. This one had no letterhead, no formal language, just a single folded page in handwriting I hadn't seen before, sharp and slanted, clearly written in a hurry. "He wants money," it read. "Don't sign anything. I'll handle it." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I stood in the hallway with that note in my trembling hands, torn between gratitude and a fear that had grown sharper edges overnight. Because somehow, impossibly, Adrian Kane already knew about a phone call I had received less than 20 hours earlier. A phone call I hadn't told a single living soul about. I understood then, standing in that dim hallway with my son's hand in mine and a stranger's handwriting pressed between my fingers, that there was no version of my life left that didn't have Adrian Kane somewhere inside it now, watching, waiting, already 3 steps ahead of trouble before I had even finished recognizing it myself. Dean Ashford was already sitting in my apartment when I got home from work, and the sight of him on my couch, feet up on my coffee table like he still had a right to be there, sent ice through every vein in my body. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, dropping my bag by the door, positioning myself instinctively between him and the hallway where Toby's after-school program bus would be dropping him off any minute. "Your landlord let me in," Dean said, unbothered, his old lazy smile stretching across a face I used to think was handsome, and now only found tired. "Told him I was Toby's father, which I am, last I checked. You don't get to just show up. I'm his father, Grace. You stopped being his father the day you walked out and didn't look back for 3 years." My voice shook, more from fury than fear now. "You don't get to decide you want the title back because it's convenient for you." He stood, straightening his jacket, and I noticed for the first time how different he looked from the man who had left us broke and humiliated 3 years ago. New watch, new shoes, a confidence that hadn't been there before, the kind that usually meant someone else was funding it. "I have a lawyer," he said. "Good one. Downtown firm. We're talking about shared custody, Grace. Maybe more, depending on how things go. A judge isn't going to love that you've got him living in a building with a cracked ceiling and a landlord who almost put you both on the street last month." The words hit exactly where he intended them to, and for a moment, the floor seemed to tilt under me. Every fear I had carried for 3 years, every nightmare about losing Toby to a system that judged mothers by their bank accounts rather than their love, rose up at once, choking off my ability to answer. "Get out," I managed finally. "We'll talk soon," Dean said, brushing past me toward the door, close enough that I caught the expensive, unfamiliar smell of his cologne. "Papers will be coming. You should get a lawyer of your own, if you can afford one." He left before I could respond, and I stood frozen in my own living room for a long moment, shaking, before the sound of Toby's excited voice in the hallway snapped me back into motion. I wiped my face quickly, forced a smile, and opened the door for my son, as if the world hadn't just tilted sideways beneath my feet. That night, once Toby was asleep, I called the number on the plain white card without hesitation this time. "He came to my apartment," I said the moment Adrian answered, the words spilling out before I could soften them. "Dean, my ex. He said he has a lawyer. He's talking about custody, Adrian. He's never once cared about custody in 3 years, and suddenly he shows up with new shoes and a lawyer downtown, and I don't understand where any of it is coming from." There was a pause on the other end, brief but heavy. "Where did he say the lawyer's office was?" "Downtown. He didn't give me a name." "I'll find out." His voice had shifted into something colder, more focused, the tone I imagined he used with the men who worked for him, rather than the tone he'd used sitting across from me in the diner. "Grace, I need you to listen to me carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't meet with him alone. Don't agree to any conversation without someone present who isn't him." "You said that in your note. I didn't sign anything." "Good." Another pause. "I have a guess about where the money for that lawyer is coming from, and if I'm right, this is bigger than a custody dispute." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, bigger?" "I mean I've made enemies in this city, Grace. The kind who don't come at me directly because they know that's a losing fight. They come at the people around me instead. If someone found out you and I have been talking, and if they're smart enough to realize hurting you hurts me faster than any bullet could, your ex-husband just became a very useful tool for someone who isn't him." I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed so tightly to my ear it ached. "You think someone is paying Dean to take my son from me?" "I think it's possible," Adrian said, and I could hear the effort in his voice to keep it steady, controlled, for my sake. "I'm going to find out for certain. I need you to trust me for a few days, even though I know that's asking a great deal from someone who barely knows me." Trust doesn't come free, Adrian. Not for me. Not anymore. "I'm not asking for free," he said quietly. "I'm asking because I don't see another way to keep you and Toby safe, and because I'd rather you be angry at me for interfering than grieving something I could have prevented." The weight of that sentence settled over me slowly, and for the first time since the diner, I let myself really consider what it meant that a man like Adrian Kane was choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to plant himself between my small, fragile life and whatever storm was building around it. "Okay," I said finally, the word costing me more than he could have known. "I trust you. For now." 3 days passed in a blur of anxious waiting, my nerves stretched thin every time the phone rang or a knock sounded at my door. I kept Toby close, walked him to and from the bus stop myself instead of letting him ride his bike the 2 blocks alone like he usually did, and jumped at shadows that hadn't bothered me in months. On the 4th day, Adrian showed up at my door again, this time with a folder tucked under his arm and an expression carved from stone. "Sit down, Grace," he said, and something about the gentleness underneath the command told me I wasn't going to like what came next. I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded tightly in my lap, and he laid the folder open in front of me. Inside were photographs, bank statements, names circled in red ink I didn't recognize. He walked me through it slowly, patiently, the way someone might explain something to a person standing at the edge of a cliff, careful not to startle them into falling. The lawyer downtown had been paid, in full, 3 weeks earlier by a shell company that traced back, through several careful layers, to a man named Victor Marsh. Victor Marsh, Adrian explained, had been trying to take territory from him for the better part of a year, quietly, patiently, testing every weakness before committing to open war. The diner shooting hadn't been random. It had been Marsh's first real move, a message that he was done being patient. When it failed, when I sat down at that table instead of running, and somehow became part of the story without ever meaning to, Marsh had apparently decided I was worth investigating. He found out about Dean, Adrian said. Found out Toby's father had walked away years ago and never looked back. It wasn't hard to buy his loyalty after that. Money, mostly. A promise of more, if the custody case dragged on long enough to keep you distracted, desperate, and vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Adrian's jaw tightened. To anything Marsh decides he needs from you once he has enough leverage. I don't know exactly what his endgame is yet. I know I'm not going to let him find out whether it works. I stared at the photographs spread across my kitchen table, at the careful red circles connecting my ex-husband to a name I had never heard before that moment, and felt something inside me that had been frightened for 3 straight years, finally curdle into something closer to fury. "He used my son," I said quietly, "as a weapon against you." "Yes." "And Dean let him." "Yes." I pressed my palms flat against the table to stop my hands from shaking, breathing slowly, forcing my mind to work through the fear instead of drowning in it. "What do we do now?" "We," Adrian said, and something about the way he said the word, deliberate, final, settled something in my chest I hadn't realized was still unsettled. "Make sure Marsh understands that touching you and Toby was the worst mistake he's made, in a very long career of mistakes. I don't want anyone hurt because of me." "Nobody has to get hurt," he said, though the flat certainty in his voice told me he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "Marsh is a businessman before he's anything else. Businessmen understand losses. I intend to make this custody scheme cost him far more than he expected to pay." Over the following days, I watched a version of Adrian Kane I hadn't seen before. Methodical, relentless, working behind the scenes with a patience that felt more frightening than any outburst of temper could have been. Dean's expensive new lawyer suddenly withdrew from the case, citing a conflict of interest that appeared out of nowhere. The custody papers that had been threatened never materialized. Dean himself stopped answering his phone entirely, and when I finally worked up the courage to drive past his apartment building, I found it empty, a "for rent" sign taped crookedly in the window, as if he had left in a hurry and never planned on coming back. I called Adrian the moment I saw it, hands trembling on the steering wheel. "What did you do?" "I had a conversation with him," Adrian said carefully. "I explained his options. He chose to relocate." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you need, Grace. His voice softened, just slightly. Nobody was hurt. I made him a promise instead. He understood it clearly enough to leave the state without needing to be told twice. I wanted to believe that was the whole truth, and some small, exhausted part of me decided, for the moment, that it didn't matter whether it was or not, because for the first time in 3 years, my son was safe, my home was secure, and the fear that had followed me every single day since Dean walked out had finally, impossibly, gone quiet. In the strange, quiet week that followed, Adrian started coming by more often, though never with the same tense urgency as before. He would arrive in the early evening, sometimes with takeout from a restaurant I couldn't have afforded on my own, sometimes with nothing but a bag of the cheap chocolate Toby loved and a willingness to sit on my wobbly kitchen chair while my son told him, in exhaustive detail, about dinosaurs, or spaceships, or whichever subject had captured his 6-year-old imagination that particular day. I watched him during those visits more than I let myself admit. There was a careful gentleness in the way he listened to Toby, an attentiveness that seemed at odds with everything the rest of the city believed about him, and I found myself wondering, more than once, which version of Adrian Kane was the truer one. The man who could make a dangerous rival's lawyer disappear with a single conversation, or the man who sat cross-legged on my living room floor, helping my son build a tower out of mismatched blocks, laughing softly when it toppled over for the 3rd time. "You're different with him," I said one evening, after Toby had finally fallen asleep, and Adrian lingered by the door instead of leaving right away. "Different how?" "Softer." I crossed my arms, studying him in the dim hallway light. "It doesn't match the rest of you." "Maybe the rest of me is the part that doesn't match," he said. And there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it. A crack in the composure he wore like armor everywhere else. "I grew up in a house where softness got you hurt faster than anything else. I learned early to bury it where nobody could use it against me. Your son doesn't know enough about the world yet to be dangerous to me. That makes it easier, being soft around him." "And around me?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Around you it's harder," he admitted finally, "because you're not a child, and you could absolutely use it against me if you wanted to. I don't want to hurt you, Adrian." "I know." His eyes held mine, steady in a way that made my breath catch somewhere in my chest. "That's exactly what makes it dangerous." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, and he left without pushing further, the way he always seemed to know exactly when to stop before I could retreat behind my own walls. But something had shifted between us in that quiet hallway, something neither of us named out loud, and I found myself thinking about him at odd hours over the following days, folding laundry at the laundromat at midnight, scrubbing floors before dawn, wondering what it would feel like to stop being afraid of what he was, and simply let myself feel whatever this had already become. I mentioned none of this to my sister when she called to check in, mentioned nothing at all about Adrian Kane, because I didn't yet have the words to explain how a man everyone in the city feared had somehow become the steadiest, safest presence in my life since Toby was born. It would have sounded insane, spoken out loud. It felt insane, most days, even just thought quietly to myself. Toby, for his part, had taken to asking when Adrian would visit next, with the easy, uncomplicated affection of a child who had decided, somewhere along the way, that this particular stranger belonged in our small orbit permanently. I didn't have the heart to tell him I wasn't sure that was safe to promise, not with a man like Victor Marsh still out there somewhere, absorbing his losses, deciding what to do next. I should have known the quiet wouldn't last. I should have recognized, after everything I had already learned about the world Adrian moved through, that a man who lost a custody scheme and a paid lawyer in the same week was not a man who simply walked away and let the matter rest. The first sign came on a Tuesday, small enough that I almost dismissed it. A dark sedan parked across the street from Toby's school, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see who sat inside. I noticed it while waiting at the crosswalk, and something instinctive in me, some new alertness I had picked up over the past weeks without meaning to, made me memorize the license plate before hurrying Toby along faster than usual. I called Adrian the moment we were home, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. He listened without interrupting, asked for the plate number twice to be sure he had it right, and told me, in a voice carefully stripped of the alarm I could still hear underneath it, that he would look into it immediately. "It's probably nothing," I said, half to convince myself. "It's probably not nothing," he answered honestly, because he had never once lied to me, not even when a comforting lie would have been easier to give. "But it's also probably not urgent yet. Marsh likes to watch before he acts. Watching means he hasn't decided what to do about us yet. That gives us time. Time to do what? Time for me to make sure whatever he decides to do, he decides against instead." I didn't sleep well that night, lying awake listening for sounds outside my window that weren't there, replaying the sight of that dark sedan, over and over, until the image blurred with imagined dangers my exhausted mind supplied on its own. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed once with a single message from Adrian. "Car identified. Being handled. Sleep." I read it 4 times before I finally let my eyes close, and even then, sleep came thin and shallow, full of half-formed dreams, where dark sedans followed me down every street in the city, and Adrian was always one turn behind, never quite close enough to catch up before the dream dissolved into morning. It wouldn't stay quiet for long. Victor Marsh, I would soon learn, did not take losses gracefully, and the peace Adrian had bought us with careful words and quiet threats was only the calm settling in before the real storm arrived. The laundromat's back door slammed open at 11 at night, and before I could turn around, a hand closed over my mouth, and a voice I didn't recognize whispered directly into my ear that I needed to come quietly if I wanted to see my son again. Every ounce of blood drained from my body in that instant. I hadn't been thinking about Marsh, hadn't been thinking about dark sedans or watching eyes, because Toby was safely with the neighbor 2 floors down for the night, a woman I trusted, and I had let myself believe, foolishly, that the danger had passed weeks ago when the sedan disappeared from outside the school, and Adrian assured me it had been dealt with. I fought. Every instinct in my body screamed to fight, and I did, twisting hard enough to drive my elbow into whoever held me, hearing a grunt of pain in response. But there were 2 of them, and I was one exhausted, terrified woman against men who clearly did this for a living, and within moments, my hands were bound, and a cloth bag dropped over my head, plunging me into a suffocating darkness that smelled like motor oil and stale cigarettes. They shoved me into the back of a vehicle, and I lost track of time during the drive that followed, my mind spiraling through every worst possibility, praying desperately that Toby was safe, that this was about me and only me, that whoever had taken me hadn't gone anywhere near the apartment where my son was sleeping, trusting the world to keep him safe. When the bag finally came off my head, I was sitting in a cold, dimly lit room, some kind of warehouse, judging by the exposed pipes and concrete floor, and standing in front of me was a man I had never met, but recognized instantly from the photographs Adrian had shown me weeks earlier. Victor Marsh looked nothing like I had imagined. He was smaller than Adrian, unremarkable in a gray suit that could have belonged to any accountant, with pale eyes that held none of the controlled stillness Adrian carried, and instead flickered with a restless, hungry kind of impatience. "Grace Bennett," he said, walking a slow circle around the chair I was tied to. "The woman who managed to do what half this city's enemies of Adrian Kane couldn't. You made him careless. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me." His voice sharpened. I've been watching him for months. Careful, controlled. Never once let anything close enough to use against him. Not in years. Then you sit down at his table, and suddenly, he's rescinding evictions, and burying custody lawsuits, and personally driving off husbands who owe him nothing. That's not the behavior of a careful man, Grace. That's the behavior of a man with a weakness. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I forced my voice to stay level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. If you're trying to use me against him, you should know he doesn't negotiate. You'll get nothing from him by hurting me. I don't need to hurt you, Marsh said, crouching slightly to bring his pale eyes level with mine. I just need him to know I could. That's usually enough. Men like Adrian understand leverage. They spend their whole careers building it against everyone else. It's almost poetic, watching them learn how it feels from the other side. He straightened, pulled a phone from his jacket, and I watched with a sick, helpless dread as he dialed a number I somehow already knew belonged to Adrian. "I have something of yours," Marsh said into the phone, his voice pleasant, almost cheerful, in a way that made my skin crawl. He held the phone toward me, close enough that I could hear Adrian's voice on the other end demanding, low and dangerous, to know where I was. "Grace," Adrian said, and even through the small, tinny speaker I could hear something raw underneath the control in his voice, something I had never heard from him before. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," I managed, my voice shaking despite every effort to steady it. Marsh pulled the phone back before I could say anything else. "She's fine, for now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on you, Adrian. I want the East Side warehouses, all of them, signed over by tomorrow morning, and I want your word you won't move against me again. Fail either condition, and I stop being reasonable." There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting, terrified of what Adrian might say, terrified of what it would cost him if he agreed, terrified of what would happen to me if he didn't. "You'll have your answer in an hour," Adrian said finally, his voice flat, controlled, giving away nothing. "Don't touch her. Don't move her. If either of those things happens before I call back, there won't be a negotiation left to have." Marsh ended the call with a satisfied smile, tucking the phone away, and settled into a metal chair across from me to wait, humming quietly under his breath, as if this were nothing more than an ordinary evening's business. I sat there in silence, wrists aching against the rope, mind racing through everything Adrian had built, every warehouse, every year of careful, dangerous work, and understood with a sick certainty that he was about to hand over a piece of his entire life to save mine. The hour crawled by in unbearable silence, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water somewhere in the warehouse, and Marsh checking his watch with growing impatience. When Adrian finally called back, Marsh answered with obvious satisfaction, expecting surrender. What he got instead was chaos. The warehouse door crashed open with a violence that made me flinch, and within seconds, the dim room filled with movement, shadows breaking apart into men I recognized from the diner, from Adrian's careful, quiet entourage, moving with a precision that told me this had never truly been a negotiation at all, only a delay long enough for Adrian to find exactly where Marsh had taken me. Marsh scrambled for a weapon, but Adrian was already across the room, faster and more controlled in his fury than I had ever seen him, closing the distance before Marsh's hand fully closed around the gun on the table beside him. I watched, breath caught somewhere in my throat, as the two men grappled for control of the weapon, and for one horrifying moment, I was certain I was about to watch someone die in front of me. The gun clattered to the concrete floor, kicked away by one of Adrian's men, and Marsh found himself pinned, breathless, all his careful cruelty replaced suddenly by naked fear, as Adrian's hand closed around his collar. "You brought this to her," Adrian said, his voice low and terrible, in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. "You could have come after me 100 different ways, and you chose to put your hands on a woman who has nothing to do with the war between us. That was the last mistake you'll ever get to make in this city. Adrian, please, we can still talk. We're done talking." I don't know exactly what happened after that, because two of Adrian's men moved quickly to untie me and guide me toward the door, shielding my view with practiced efficiency, and I let them, too exhausted and shaken to argue, my legs barely steady enough to carry me. But I heard Marsh's voice cut off sharply behind me, heard the particular kind of silence that followed, and understood without needing to see it that Victor Marsh would not be troubling either of us again. Adrian found me outside a few minutes later, his composure back in place except for his eyes, which held something raw and unguarded I had never seen from him before. He crossed the distance between us without a word and pulled me into his arms, holding on tightly enough that I could feel his heart pounding as hard as mine. "I thought I was going to lose you," he said quietly against my hair, his voice rough in a way that undid something inside me completely. "I'm here," I whispered, clutching the front of his coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "I'm okay, Toby. Is safe." I sent someone to check on him the moment Marsh called me. He never left the apartment. He doesn't know any of this happened. Relief crashed through me so violently my knees nearly buckled, and Adrian held me steady, his arms tightening around me as if he had no intention of letting go anytime soon. Standing there in the cold night air outside a warehouse that had nearly become the site of the worst night of my life, I understood, with a clarity that frightened and comforted me in equal measure, exactly how far this man was willing to go to keep me and my son safe, and exactly how impossible it had become to keep pretending I didn't feel the same fierce, unshakable pull toward him that he clearly felt toward me. "This isn't over yet," Adrian said quietly, pulling back just enough to look at me. "Marsh had people. Some of them will want to finish what he started, out of loyalty or fear or greed. I need you to trust me one more time, Grace. I need you and Toby somewhere safe, until every last piece of this is cleaned up." I looked up at him, at the man half the city feared, and the man who had just torn a warehouse apart to save my life, and found, to my own surprise, that the fear I had carried since the moment I first sat at his table had finally, completely, transformed into something else entirely. Adrian took us to a house on the edge of the city that night, tucked behind a stand of tall pines, far enough from anything familiar that my racing mind finally began to settle, from the sheer distance between us and everything that had happened. Toby was already asleep when we arrived, carried in gently by one of Adrian's men who had collected him from the neighbor's apartment, with a story about a surprise trip that Toby, half asleep and easily delighted, accepted without a single question. I stood in the doorway of the guest room and watched my son sleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily under a blanket that wasn't his own, and felt the last of my adrenaline drain out of me all at once, leaving my legs weak and my hands trembling in a way they hadn't during the actual danger itself. Adrian appeared behind me quietly, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him without him touching me, giving me space he seemed to instinctively understand I needed. "He's fine," Adrian said softly. "Whatever else happens, he never has to know how close tonight came to going differently." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found me in time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid that saying it too loudly would make the fear real again. "What happens to him, if something happens to me?" "Nothing is going to happen to you." Adrian's voice carried a certainty that startled me with its intensity. "I made a mistake tonight, Grace. I let myself believe the sedan outside the school was the end of it, that Marsh would back down after losing the lawyer and the custody case. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me everything that matters. I won't make that mistake again." I turned to look at him properly then, taking in the exhaustion carved into his face, the tension still coiled in his shoulders, even hours after the warehouse had gone silent behind us. "This is the life you live," I said quietly. "Every day, isn't it? Watching for the mistake that costs you everything." "It used to be easier," he admitted, "before there was anything left for me to lose. I built a career out of having nothing anyone could take from me. You changed that the moment you sat down across from me. I've been trying to decide ever since whether that was the worst thing that's happened to me in years, or the only good thing. And which is it?" His eyes held mine in the dim hallway light, and something in his expression shifted, softened, dropped every last piece of the careful control I had watched him wear, like a second skin since the night we met. "I don't have to decide anymore," he said quietly. "I already know." We stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken between us finally settling into something clearer. Something neither of us seemed willing to name out loud just yet, though I suspected we both already understood exactly what it was. Eventually I stepped back, glancing once more at my sleeping son, and let Adrian guide me toward the kitchen, where he made tea neither of us really wanted just to have something to do with our hands, while the last of the adrenaline worked its way out of our systems. We talked for hours that night, longer and more openly than we ever had before, about his childhood in a house where softness got you hurt, about mine spent watching my own mother work 3 jobs and never once complain out loud, about the specific loneliness of building a life entirely around keeping other people safe, while never quite trusting anyone enough to let them do the same for you. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window began to lighten toward morning, something fundamental between us had shifted, quietly and completely, in a way neither the warehouse nor the fear that came before it had managed to touch. "There are still pieces of Marsh's organization out there," Adrian said eventually, watching the first gray light creep over the pines outside. "People loyal to him, people who might still want to make a point even with him gone. I need a few more days to make sure every one of them understands this is finished. And after that? He looked at me then, with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Something almost unguarded, almost afraid, an emotion that seemed foreign on a face, built for controlled stillness. After that, he said quietly, I intend to ask you something I should have asked weeks ago, if I hadn't been so certain that letting you close to me was the most dangerous thing I could do to you. Ask me now, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice came out. Not like this, he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face for the first time since the warehouse. Not with you exhausted and half in shock and Toby asleep down the hall. When I ask you, Grace, I want you to actually be able to hear it. I didn't push further, though curiosity burned quietly under my exhaustion, and instead let myself lean into the strange, fragile peace of that kitchen, that early morning light, that quiet house at the edge of the city, where for the first time in longer than I could remember, nothing was chasing us at all. Okay, I said, wherever you need us to go. 3 men grabbed Toby off the playground while I was inside signing school forms, and the scream that tore out of me when I looked up through the office window and saw the empty swing still moving felt like it ripped something loose inside my chest that would never fully heal. I don't remember running outside. I don't remember screaming his name until my voice cracked. I remember the teacher's aide holding my arms, telling me she'd already called the office, that security cameras had caught a dark van pulling away from the far side of the lot, and I remember the world narrowing down to a single, unbearable point of terror that swallowed everything else whole. I called Adrian with hands shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone. They took him, I choked out. Adrian. They took Toby. The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat, but it was the most terrifying silence I had ever heard, because even Adrian, even the man who had never once lost his composure in front of me, sounded shaken to his core when he finally spoke. Where are you? The school. Adrian, please. I'm coming. Stay exactly where you are. Don't talk to anyone else. I'll have people there in minutes. He arrived faster than should have been possible, skidding to a stop in front of the school with 2 cars behind him, and the moment he reached me, I collapsed against him, unable to hold myself upright any longer, under the weight of pure, animal terror. I thought this was finished, I sobbed against his chest. You said Marcia's people understood it was over. Most of them did. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than any anger I'd heard from him before. One of them clearly didn't. He pulled back to look at me, his hands framing my face, forcing me to focus through the panic. I need you to breathe, Grace. I need you steady enough to help me find him. Because every minute matters right now, and I can't do this without you thinking clearly. Somehow, impossibly, his steadiness anchored mine, and I forced air into my lungs, forced my mind past the screaming panic toward something usable. Within minutes, his men had pulled security footage from a laptop in one of the cars, grainy and dark but clear enough to make out a partial plate number on the van, and Adrian was on the phone immediately, his voice cutting through the chaos with sharp, precise instructions to people I had never met, men and women scattered across the city who apparently owed him favors, information, loyalty built over years I knew nothing about. There's a man who used to run with Marsh, Adrian said, ending one call and immediately dialing another. Calls himself Elliot. He went quiet after the warehouse, but quiet doesn't mean gone. If anyone wanted to make one last point against me, it would be him. Do you know where he'd take him? I have an idea. Adrian's jaw was tight, his eyes hard, in a way I had only glimpsed once before. In the warehouse, right before everything happened too fast for me to fully witness. There's an old processing plant near the docks Marsh used to store product. Nobody's touched it since the warehouse. It would make sense as a place to hide, and it would make sense to Elliot as a place to send a message. We drove there together, Adrian's hand finding mine across the console at every red light, both of us silent, both of us braced for whatever waited at the end of that drive. I had never in my life felt fear like that, sharp and total, blotting out every other thought except the image of my son's face, his small hand always finding mine without hesitation, the way he had reached for Adrian's hand that very first night without an ounce of fear. The plant sat dark and abandoned against the waterfront, rusted metal siding, broken windows catching the last gray light of the afternoon. Adrian's men fanned out around the perimeter with a coordinated silence that spoke of long practice, and Adrian himself moved toward the main entrance with a focus so absolute, it frightened me almost as much as it reassured me. We found Toby in a small back office, tied loosely to a chair, tear-streaked but otherwise unharmed, guarded by a single man who barely had time to reach for his weapon before Adrian was across the room. I didn't watch what happened next. I ran straight to my son instead, fumbling with the ropes around his small wrists, my own hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to loosen the knot, and the moment he was free, he threw himself against me, sobbing into my shoulder, and I held him so tightly I probably hurt him, and neither of us cared at all. "Mommy!" he cried. The scary man said Adrian would come. He said Adrian always comes. I looked up over my son's head to find Adrian standing in the doorway, breathing hard, his shirt torn at the collar, watching us with an expression that stripped away every last piece of the composed, dangerous man the city feared, leaving behind only someone who looked, in that moment, entirely undone by relief. "He was right," Adrian said quietly. "I always come." The man who had taken Toby, I learned later, was indeed Elliot, one of Marsh's former lieutenants who had decided, apparently on his own initiative, that avenging his former boss was worth the risk. Adrian's men had him in custody before I even finished checking Toby over for injuries, and whatever conversation followed happened somewhere out of my sight, out of my hearing, and I found, standing there with my son wrapped safely in my arms, that I didn't need to know the details to understand it would be the last time anyone connected to Victor Marsh ever came near my family again. We drove home in near silence, Toby exhausted into sleep within minutes of the car starting to move, and Adrian kept one hand on the wheel and one hand wrapped around mine the entire way, as if letting go even for a moment felt like too great a risk after everything that had nearly been lost that day. That night, once Toby was finally asleep in his own bed again, safe and unharmed, and already half convinced the entire ordeal had been an exciting adventure rather than the nightmare it actually was, Adrian and I sat together on my worn couch, in a silence that felt different from every silence that had come before it. Softer, steadier, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally, truly passed. "I can't keep living like this," I said eventually, my voice quiet in the dim apartment. "Not the fear of you, Adrian. I stopped being afraid of you a long time ago. I mean the fear of what your world can reach into mine and take. Today I thought I'd lost him. I don't know how to survive that fear twice." "You won't have to," Adrian said, turning to face me fully, his expression more open and unguarded than I had ever seen it. "Marsh is gone. Elliot won't trouble anyone again. I've spent the last several hours making absolutely certain there's no one left in this city who believes touching you or Toby is a viable way to reach me. I built that world, Grace. I know exactly how to close every door in it. And what happens next time someone new decides you're worth challenging?" "There will always be someone," he admitted honestly, because he had never once lied to me, not even now, when a comforting lie might have been easier. "That's the truth of the life I live, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. But I promise you this, whatever comes, you and Toby will never face it unprotected again. Not for a single day, for as long as I'm alive to prevent it." I studied his face in the low light, searching for any trace of doubt, any hesitation, and found none. Only that same absolute certainty I had first glimpsed the night he told me I wasn't walking away after sitting down at his table. A promise I had thought at the time was simply the arrogance of a dangerous man used to getting whatever he wanted. I understood now it had never been arrogance at all. It had been the truth, spoken plainly, from the very first moment. "Ask me now," I said softly, remembering the promise he'd made in that quiet kitchen days earlier. "Whatever you were waiting to ask me now." Adrian's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through the careful control that had defined him since the moment I met him, and he reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small velvet box that he must have been carrying for longer than I realized, waiting for the right moment that had somehow arrived in the middle of the worst day either of us had lived through in years. "I was going to do this somewhere better than your couch," After a day that didn't nearly cost me everything I love, he said, a faint, rough laugh escaping him despite everything. But I've learned tonight that waiting for perfect moments is a luxury people in my world don't always get to have. He opened the box, and inside sat a simple, elegant ring that caught the dim light of my living room lamp. Nothing flashy, nothing that announced wealth the way everything else about him usually did. Just something quietly beautiful, chosen. I understood instantly, with real thought behind it. Grace Bennett, he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. You sat down at my table on the worst night of my year, and somehow made it the best decision I never knew I needed to make. You brought a 6-year-old boy into my life who calls my name the moment he sees me, and a mother who never once wanted anything from me except honesty, which is the one thing nobody in my world has ever asked for before you. I don't have a normal life to offer you, I never will, but I can promise you a safe one, and a loved one, for exactly as long as you'll let me be part of it. Tears blurred my vision, and I found myself laughing and crying at once, overwhelmed by a day that had begun in the worst terror of my life, and somehow arrived here, in this quiet apartment, with this impossible, dangerous, gentle man kneeling in front of me with his heart laid entirely bare. Yes, I said, before he could even finish forming the actual question, because I already knew every word of it by heart, had known it, somehow, since the very first night he told me I wasn't walking away after. Yes, Adrian, I'll marry you. He slid the ring onto my finger with hands that weren't quite steady, and when he pulled me into his arms, I felt every last trace of fear I had carried since the diner finally, completely dissolve, replaced by something I hadn't let myself believe I deserved, in 3 long, exhausted years of surviving alone. Toby found us there in the morning, curled together on the worn couch, and when he spotted the ring on my finger, his whole face lit up with a joy so pure it made both of us laugh through fresh tears. "Does this mean Adrian's staying?" he asked, climbing up between us with the easy confidence of a child who had decided, somewhere back at that diner table, that this particular stranger belonged to us permanently. "Forever," Adrian said, pulling my son into the circle of his arms alongside me, and for the first time since a gun had gone off in a crowded diner and changed the entire shape of my life, I let myself believe completely that the word was true. The months between that morning on the couch and our wedding day were not without their difficulties. Adrian spent weeks quietly restructuring parts of his world I never fully understood, distancing himself from the more dangerous corners of a business he had built out of necessity, long before I ever knew him, though he was honest enough never to promise me he could walk away from all of it entirely. I learned to accept that truth, the way I had learned to accept every other hard truth in my life, not with blind acceptance, but with clear eyes and a steady heart, choosing him again each day rather than once, in a single moment of relief and gratitude. We moved into a house with a real yard, one Toby could ride his bike around without me watching every passing car with suspicion, and slowly, carefully, something like an ordinary life began to take root around the extraordinary way it had started. Adrian came to every school event he could manage, sat through an entire dinosaur-themed birthday party with more patience than I thought a man in his position could possibly possess, and learned, gradually, how to let the softness he once buried for survival exist openly in the daylight, instead of only behind closed doors. I went back to school myself that autumn, something I had given up on years earlier, when survival left no room for ambition, studying in the evenings after Toby was asleep, while Adrian handled calls in his study down the hall, both of us building, in our own separate ways, toward a future neither of us had believed we were allowed to want. There were harder days too, moments when old fear crept back in small ways, when I flinched at a car idling too long outside the grocery store, when Toby asked quiet questions about the day he'd been taken that I answered as honestly as a 6-year-old could handle. Adrian never once grew impatient with those moments, never rushed my healing or treated my fear as an inconvenience to be managed. He simply stayed, steady and present, exactly as he had promised that first terrible night at the warehouse near the docks, proving again and again that his word, once given, was the one truly unbreakable thing in a life otherwise built on danger and uncertainty. We were married the following spring, a small, quiet ceremony, in the same diner where it had all begun. The owner delighted to close the place early for us. The same booth in the back, decorated simply with white flowers instead of coffee cups. Toby stood beside us the whole time, proud in his small suit, insisting on holding the rings himself in a small wooden box he had picked out and decorated with his own careful drawings of stars and rockets, utterly certain of his role in the most important moment of our small family's life. My sister cried through the entire ceremony, still not fully able to reconcile the composed, careful man standing at the altar with the reputation that had once made her beg me over the phone to stay far away from him. A handful of Adrian's closest people stood quietly near the back, men and women I had come to trust over the months, faces that had once frightened me, now familiar and welcome in the small, warm room. When Adrian slipped the wedding band onto my finger, I thought back to that first terrified night. The empty seat, the question I had asked without knowing it would change everything. "Can I sit here?" I had asked a stranger who held half a city in his hands. "Sit," he had told me, "but you're not walking away after." He had been right about that from the very first moment, and standing there in that same diner, surrounded by everyone who had helped carry us through the danger to reach this quiet, steady joy, I understood I had never truly wanted to walk away at all. I had spent 3 years believing strength meant surviving entirely alone, carrying every burden without help, trusting no one enough to share the weight. Adrian Kane had taught me, in the strangest, most dangerous way imaginable, that real strength sometimes meant sitting down at the one table with an open seat, even when every instinct told you to keep walking, and trusting that whatever waited there might just be the beginning of everything you never knew you were allowed to have.